Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. Just going to give it a few seconds here while people join. Okay, well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Up for Growth 2021 Virtual Summit for Housing Changemakers. My name is Maria Salinas. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce and will be your moderator today. This is the How More Housing Creates Jobs, Supports Business, and Drives Innovation. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I'd like to give you a brief overview of Up for Growth, an organization that I am deeply engaged with because of its work to create a world where housing is always an opportunity, not an obstacle. Up for Growth is a national cross-sector member network committed to solving the housing shortage and affordability crisis through data-driven research and evidence-based policy. They provide timely research and insights on housing policy at the local, state, and federal levels, along with convening opportunities like today's event. Membership is open to organizations of all sizes. And if you'd like to learn more, you can navigate to the link shown at the bottom of this slide, and I encourage you to do so. So let's get started, and I'm going to ask our panelists, our amazing panelists, to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Mayor Bramson. Mayor?
Well, thank you very much, Maria. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. New Rochelle is a community of about 80,000 residents just outside of New York City, very diverse by every metric, demographically, land use characteristics. And over the last few years, we've approved just about 7,000 new housing units, looking to ramp up to 10,000. So that's significant in absolute terms as well as relative to our overall size. And I'm looking forward to talking about the specific measures that we took in order to accomplish that, as well as the obstacles that we've had to overcome.
Wonderful. Welcome, Mayor. David Williams, Policy Outreach Director for Opportunity Insights at Harvard.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Opportunity Insights, our specialty is using big data to study issues of economic inequality and economic mobility. And a lot of our work has focused on the importance and impact of neighborhoods, especially on families and low-income children. And that has gotten us involved in the housing space and in housing policy conversations, because we see that really housing is central to helping create springboards to opportunity, given how our environment and our neighborhood context informs our upbringing. So excited to add that perspective to this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome. And Dr. Michael Wilkerson, a partner at EcoNorthwest. If I said that correctly, please feel free to correct me.
You got it, Maria. Well, thank you, everyone, for the opportunity this morning. I have a couple slides prepared to share with you to kind of help frame the discussion. As Maria mentioned, I'm a partner at EcoNorthwest and serve as our Director of Data Analytics, and really trained as an urban economist and study the intersection of land use, transportation, and economic development, and have been fortunate enough to partner with great organizations like Up for Growth as a collaborator and thought leader to produce some of these reports that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, the national study and some of our statewide studies. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar, a couple of my colleagues did a preview webinar that's available on the website that details some of the findings of the report, and we're excited to continue this next iteration of the studies. I think, just to kind of set the stage today for our discussion, many of you on this call, I think comes as a surprise to nobody, but off the backs of the longest expansion in U.S. history prior to COVID, housing wasn't produced at anywhere near the rates that we saw in the several decades preceding that. And I think this is come into clear focus now. And one of the things that the underproduction report looked at was trying to understand the orders of magnitude, and particularly where those problems are most acute. I think many times we look at housing and the prices go up everywhere. But I think what's important to understand is how are they going up, let's say, relative to inflation and or incomes. And when you look at this map of the 200 plus metro areas across the country, you see in some places prices, although they have gone up nominally relative to inflation, it's the blue areas, aren't really going up faster than inflation. And those are kind of what we think about as healthy, normal performing markets. You look at other parts of the country where prices are up double and sometimes triple. Those are the pinch points where we now know we have a shortage of housing, and that's led to housing affordability challenges. I think as it relates particularly to this panel today, we're interested in understanding, what are the dynamics around jobs, right, and income, and how do those interact with housing? And I think, these are complicated relationships. You look at the charts here, there's lots of dots. The dots are cities, and they're looking at, on the left, new jobs since 2008 relative to new housing units. And the title of the City Lab was "Cities with More New Homes Have More New Jobs." I think you could easily flip that on its head and say places with more new housing also enable more jobs to happen. And it's a bi-directional relationship that I think is important to understand. On the right-hand side, you can see this is a little bit out of date, but I think it's looking at peak recovery. So, coming out of the global financial crisis, housing prices dropped everywhere. And as they began to recover, you saw the recovery happening fastest in places where incomes had increased the most, like San Francisco, Denver, Austin, Portland, Seattle, et cetera. And I think that's an important dynamic to understand, is that relationship between income and jobs. What you've seen, though, is an evolving body of research that's really starting to quantify what the impacts are of barriers of housing. And I would say this, the seminal work in this space is through Shea and Moretti. There's a couple of versions of this paper, but effectively, you can see the headline from City Lab, NIMBYism is a huge drag on America's economic growth. And, bear with me, the quote here, Shea and Moretti basically say, misallocation of resources arises because the constraints on housing supply in the most productive US cities effectively limit the number of workers who have access to such high productivity. Instead of increasing local employment, productivity growth in housing-constrained cities primarily pushes up housing prices and nominal wages. The resulting misallocation of workers lowers aggregate output and welfare of workers in all US cities. And that number initially was something like 10% of GDP. Subsequently, there's been some revisions that push that number up to maybe 15 or possibly even close to 20% of GDP. So that's a very non-trivial, right, number that we think about of how do you quantify the impact of these regulatory barriers and the subsequent underproduction of housing. So I think the thing we want to unpack today a little bit more is, what can we do about it? And I think the question of interest is, what are you building and where are you building it? And the mayor, I think, can talk about what he's been doing and seeing in New Rochelle as a change from the status quo. And we see this across many cities, which is the share of multifamily units is increasing relative to where it was pre-global financial crisis. So you can see on the left, the orange dots were kind of 1990 to 2005 shares of multifamily. The green squares are 2006 to 2018 shares, and across the board increasing in some places, near doubling the amount of multifamily. What the reports with Up for Growth really tried to understand is, how do you change the narrative away from more of the same production into more of an accessible growth strategy, and then unpacking the environmental, fiscal, environment, and economic benefits of that growth strategy. And to put it simply, you kind of have, various scales of development. Your typical detached housing, which if you looked at the areas that have underproduced housing is the predominant type of housing, over 50%. You have some missing middle and very low high density housing. What accessible growth says is, if you could enable housing to occur in the places that would really facilitate that based on neighborhood scale, access to jobs, access to transit, and importantly, access to economic opportunity, what would you instead want to build? And that really shifts away from detached housing into much more of that middle housing, into some podium, and really enabling more high density and TOD to happen. And so, what does that look like? You can see maps of various cities. It's widespread across all cities. It's in every state. It's in every congressional district. This notion of, where could you build accessible growth? To put some pictures to it, I think, understanding the neighborhood scale is important. It's taking what are largely single family neighborhoods and introducing middle housing through ADUs and others, getting into corridors, putting in row houses, some podium construction, 2-3 story buildings, and then really understanding where are there opportunities to really increase density in strong transit served locations and locations with jobs where you can put in podiums in higher density. And so what the report found, in quick summary is, there are big benefits environmentally here in terms of fewer cars on the road, something like a 28% reduction across all jurisdictions for those new units. And importantly, on the GDP side of the equation, building any unit of housing is important. It's a cornerstone of our economy, right? And oftentimes a leading indicator of what we're doing. I think what we want to understand in the study is, what is the difference between building more of the same versus building an accessible growth strategy? And the economic benefits are very tangible, right? You can see that on the right-hand side, looking at building that 7 million units over a 20-year time horizon generates, trillions of dollars of GDP. But importantly, I think it's that delta. And the delta really, if you kind of boil it down, for every 1,000 units that you would build right across the country in these needed areas, can generate an additional 60 million in GDP over 20 years, right? So, annually, 1/20th of that, but over that 20-year time horizon, a big, big difference. So that's some data, and happy to turn it back over to Maria, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation and really setting the stage here for what we're about to talk about. So really appreciate that fascinating slides and information that you provided there. Let me go ahead and start with David, and then I'll go to you, Mayor. And then Mike, maybe you can finish off on this one question, because we have been talking about, I think there's broad agreement about the housing shortage and the housing underproduction, but really want to get to how does that impact our economy and the just daily living of our residents in our neighborhoods. What does that mean at the state and local level? Let me go to you, David, first, and then we'll go to Mayor Bramson. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to kind of add another perspective when we think about the broader economic implications of housing production. Again, a lot of our work focuses on issues like economic mobility and using big data to better understand these issues. And some of our more recent research basically uses census and IRS data of 20 million kids across the country to really track their long-term outcomes. And something we see in that data is that outcomes and long-term earnings differ dramatically based on where you grow up, right? So neighborhoods really matter, and they matter in a causal way, right? Something we even see in our data is that when an individual family moves between two places, let's say a place that had lower average outcomes and higher average outcomes, that younger sibling who ended up being exposed for more years to that higher outcome neighborhood, they on average earn more in adulthood than their older sibling who had less exposure. So again, it really speaks to the tremendous impact that neighborhoods have on our long-term outcomes. And when we use this data and look at things like affordable housing resources, something we see is that when you look at tools like Section 8 vouchers, housing choice vouchers, basically federal subsidies for rent, but also things like low-income housing tax credits and affordable housing developments. These extremely important resources for millions of families, again, provide the support that families need to be able to have access to affordable housing, but oftentimes these resources are concentrated in high poverty neighborhoods, right? These places where we see lower outcomes for kids when they grow up there. And so kind of something we have to think about is, right, are these resources in some ways actually reconcentrating poverty? And I think when you think about housing underproduction, right, that's a key driver of these issues. We worked on a project called Creating Moves to Opportunity, basically to test out and see if families using tools like the Section 8 voucher, like what barriers they faced in the housing market. And something we saw was that when those families didn't receive additional support, they were much more likely to have access to these types of places where we see better outcomes for low-income kids and vulnerable families. And so I think as we're thinking about how we increase housing production in ways that can really benefit our economy in general, a key part of this is where are those places that historically have not been as amenable to new housing production, especially affordable housing production. I think these are communities that have more restrictive zoning and other regulations that make it harder to build higher density housing, or even just duplexes, triplexes, and housing that is very moderate, this missing middle that Mike spoke of. So I think as we think about housing production overall, really making sure that we have a nuanced approach, understanding how it impacts issues of equity, how it can really impact the access that lower income families have as well, but making sure that we're not just building new units, but really thinking about how we're equitably distributing units and really targeting those places that historically may have underproduced housing, especially affordable housing for lower income families. Because just again, we see that the impact can be tremendous, and we can literally measure it in our data 5, 10, 15, and 20 years later. So I think as we think about the economic impacts of housing underproduction, also making sure that we have a targeted understanding and thinking about different types of neighborhoods and creating broader access for all families within our community. So I think it just kind of speaks to and reinforces the importance of housing and the importance of building more housing and making sure that is as accessible to a broad range of people and families as possible.
Absolutely. And I think we see that in our work too, when we're looking at, drivers of our economy, that relationship to having that access to housing in communities where there are businesses and that they're close to jobs and employment. I know that that's all something we see as well, even in a large city like Los Angeles. So thank you for that. Let me bring you into this conversation, Mayor Bramson, because I know you have been dealing with this very specifically in your community. Would love to get your perspective on this particular question.
Well, so we've in a sense faced the opposite challenge. We've had a community that has by and large been welcoming of new housing, but we found it to be a challenge to attract it. So, for a generation, city governments have been supportive of transit-oriented development, and yet despite that, we've enjoyed only mixed success. And what we've discovered is that for many years, the development community did not necessarily regard the risk-reward ratio in Rochelle as a favorable one. We had a sort of immature marketplace, which could not necessarily deliver reliable returns. And at the same point, the approval process in New York State, and I know many other places, imposes significant upfront burdens and risks associated with multiple political veto points. And so we tried to confront that with a series of measures, a form-based zoning code that is very flexible with respect to use and therefore market responsive, and at the same time prescriptive with respect to design, and therefore incorporates best planning principles that creates an appealing physical fabric for the downtown area. We undertook a generic environmental review for our full build-out objectives, 12 million square feet of allowable construction, which essentially created a shovel-ready environment for any project that fell within those boundaries. We worked with the master developer who had enhanced rights on publicly owned property and therefore sent a signal to the rest of the marketplace. And we put in place a framework for financial incentives that on the one hand assured us we would generate the revenue necessary to cover any public service expenses or infrastructure expenses, but also offered predictability and certainty to those who might invest. And the results have really been dramatic. 30 projects approved, 6 completed and leasing up, 11 that are under construction today, several more that are going to break ground within the next few months. And to the point that David made, all of this is in a mixed income community with a healthy, well-regarded school district, where folks are not confined to living only with people whose circumstances are the same as their own, but really reflecting the full spectrum of the human experience. And I think having communities which permit that is deeply important. And what we've done here can be replicated. I mean, every community, of course, is unique, but I think New Rochelle serves as a valuable proof of concept that there are tools that can be employed on the local level that can unlock the growth potential of communities like ours that have mass transit but have had difficulty gaining traction in years past.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Mike, anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think the mayor, did a great job describing kind of one of the often unknowns that you hear about is, you regularly hear about we need to remove barriers, but in many communities, removing barriers alone is not enough, particularly if you want to get a particular set of outcomes, including public benefits. So I think, that detailed description is really helpful as kind of a proof of concept, as he said.
Wonderful. And that just leads me right into the next question. I know we've all talked about in preparing for this sort of the equity lens that we need to have in looking at housing underproduction, and would love to get your thoughts around, how do we ensure that as we move forward into increasing supply, that we always have the equity lens, the attention to that. And David, maybe I'll start with you. I know this is an area that is a passion area for you, so definitely let's start with you, and then we'll do the round robin here.
Absolutely. So I think one way to make sure that kind of concepts of equity are embedded in these conversations is to potentially lead with equity as part of the reason for why we're doing this work in general. And so at Opportunity Insights, we've had the pleasure of working with a group of stakeholders in Charlotte, North Carolina, who, based on some research, despite lots of great growth and development happening in Charlotte, they found that their actual rates of economic mobility, right, the opportunity for low-income and middle-income kids was actually lacking in Charlotte. But interestingly, they took that as a call to action and really kind of galvanized the community around how do we not just become a place of new development and growth, but how do we make sure that that growth is really benefiting the most vulnerable families locally. And part of what that's done is that it's actually kind of enabled kind of much broader policymaking in Charlotte. So a few years ago, an actual ballot initiative expanded their affordable housing bond, which is now kind of investing, tens, if not hundreds more dollars in affordable housing every single year in Charlotte. There's also a kind of housing underproduction report locally in Charlotte that I think was spurred by these conversations of equity and economic mobility. And more recently, a new planning initiative was passed by City Council, a large part of which is focused on zoning reform, and especially creating more permissible zoning in areas of high opportunity to, again, create more equitable access, more equitable development of affordable housing. I think all of these things were initially framed by, and I think were really given momentum by these conversations of economic mobility. So I think, it's not only about incorporating or making sure that equity is part of the conversation, but I think equity and the understanding that housing is not just about units and production, but can actually serve as a springboard to upward mobility, I think can actually kind of inform and energize these conversations around housing and housing production. So I think it's not just about including it, but I think potentially where helpful, actually leading with the equity lens can be a real spur to action.
Yeah, I like the way you said that, leading with equity. Mike, would love to get your thoughts around this topic as well, and then we'll go to you, Mayor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think leading with equity is the appropriate framework here, and it really, traces back to decades of discriminatory practices to understand why we have the current state of affairs we have today. So, like, for example, policies like redlining. We've done some work with Opportunity Insights and can see that the negative impacts of that historical legacy still persist today. And so when you look in neighborhoods that were redlined, they typically have less economic opportunity than other areas because of the systemic kind of underinvestment in those communities. Similarly, they're the communities that have seen the most multifamily housing. And so communities that have understood how to put up barriers that benefit largely themselves, right, through the appreciation and gentrification of those exclusive neighborhoods, really have been successful in kind of limiting where growth can happen. So I think when we start to look at housing under production specifically, it's understanding, what are the constraints that are limiting growth patterns, particularly in these neighborhoods of high economic opportunity. And so exclusionary zoning has come under, a lot of scrutiny lately. And I think there are other, examples of zoning that's not calibrated to market feasible scale, right? So yes, it is permissive of something, but maybe not as much as it could be. And then also, poorly calibrated incentive zoning programs, all come at a cost. So I think for us, understanding, the status quo limits access to communities, what can we do about it? And so I think when we look at underproduction specifically and applying an equity lens, we understand that building more of the same is going to be largely, sprawl, greenfield development, and pretty exclusionary in terms of communities and requiring very extensive transportation costs and at a cost to the environment. Moving into this accessible growth strategy, delivers more economic benefits, like we showed, fiscal benefits, et cetera. And I think really starts to understand, how do you get at these barriers of decades of institutionalized outcomes that are inequitable and pretty disparate. And so I think, when we look at the data, it's not a surprise that, that decades ago are influencing the outcomes that we're seeing today. And so I think, removing barriers, absolutely. And I think importantly, as the mayor described in New Rochelle, it's also understanding that the market alone isn't always going to produce the desired outcomes. And so first, yes, we need to remove barriers. We need to target areas of intended growth, but things like funding affordable housing in those particular neighborhoods, as David described in Charlotte and as many other communities are doing, facilitating public-private partnerships, and I think creating incentive programs specifically that are calibrated to deliver a range of public benefits. I'll give you an example of, a widely used policy is inclusionary housing, right? So whether it's an inclusionary or opt-in policy, the idea is to deliver more mixed income units in neighborhoods. I think the challenge is at times, if those policies aren't properly calibrated, you actually stifle development and you end up with less housing in aggregate and certainly less mixed income communities. So we have to understand that there's a balance here, and market rate housing does deliver benefits, and certainly figuring out how to deliver as much mixed income and affordable housing as possible is really that key.
Great point on that. Thank you for sharing that. Mayor, let me pull you into this conversation because obviously, you are seeing policies on the ground within your community. Maybe you can give us your perspective on this question.
Sure, and it's vitally important. I mean, there are many people, and this is often based on historical experience, who associate development with displacement. And so I think we need to make absolutely clear and absolutely certain that sustainable growth is equitable growth, that the benefits of growth are distributed as widely as possible. Now, to some degree, that occurs simply because of the intrinsic nature of housing development. As Mike and Dave have pointed out, additional supply helps to mitigate the affordability crisis, particularly if it's TOD, with better access to sources of employment and lower transportation costs. But beyond that, I do think that inclusionary affordable housing is a powerful tool. Of the 7,000 units that we've approved in Rochelle, 1,200 of those are below market. And so what I explain to people who have concerns about this is that although the ratio of market to affordable units will shift towards market in our downtown core as a means of injecting economic energy into our city, in absolute numbers, there will be many more affordable units when we're done with this process than there were prior. Beyond that, we can really lean into ESG principles in terms of the requirements and expectations that we set for our developers, either through the duration of our pilots or through community benefits that are associated with height bonuses. We can require, for example, investments in MWBE capacity so that there's a greater opportunity to compete successfully for contracts. We can require investment in green infrastructure, particularly with an environmental justice lens. As we heard just a moment ago, there are many areas that were redlined that feature hardscape, where the urban heat island effect is a real impact, and we can take the proceeds of development at one site and redirect them to other sites that suffer from these conditions. And finally, I think investing in amenities, particularly those that impact LMI populations, Black and Brown populations. So again, to use a specific example from our city, an area that's adjacent to our downtown core that we call the Lincoln Avenue corridor has been historically marginalized and severed from the center of our city by misguided urban renewal decades ago. And so to take, for example, an overbuilt highway and repurpose it into a linear park that is both an open space resource and a readier connection to our transit hub and to employment centers in the downtown. All of these things happening simultaneously, I think, provide both the reality and the perception that all people can benefit from a well thought out strategy for sustainable growth.
Those are great examples of ways in which local government can really address this as well. So I really appreciate you citing that. And I'm going to lead with you on this next question in terms of what is the role of government in addressing housing affordability? And, we've talked about this. How can you specifically discuss sort of an emergence in state-led planning processes? And if that, in your thought, is that likely to lead to different outcomes? So would love to start with you on that question.
So, the state establishes the rules of the game within which localities operate. It creates incentive structures, it creates requirements. I know that there's been much debate about what sorts of sticks the states should use in order to prod communities, in order to foster housing development. I don't know that enough attention has been paid to the carrots. Again, just to talk about our local experience, it could very well be that there are other communities that would want to do something similar to what New Rochelle did. And yet there is a significant demand in terms of expertise and expense. You have to invest upfront in a really rigorous planning process. You have to understand how your zoning requirements will align with what the market needs and expects. You need robust public involvement in terms of defining a vision for a community. All that requires time and money. And for states to provide that to willing communities on essentially a by right basis, almost an entitlement to these kinds of fundings in a non-competitive fashion, provided that the plans they ultimately produce meet certain tests in terms of density, proximity to transit, quantity of affordable units. I think that could really enable many communities to do things that they might want to do, but don't feel like they have the tools to execute successfully. I think the state could also be helpful in establishing better metrics that help us tell a story. When we go through an environmental review right now, a tower constructed next to a train station is described as a net drain on energy and resources, as opposed to a benefit in terms of comparing it to the alternative forms of development. To the extent that we really want to explain to a sometimes skeptical public why things like high density growth are actually in our environmental interest, which is not necessarily how people look at these things intuitively, I think the state having standardized metrics that tell the story more clearly, that could be very helpful as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And David and Mike would love to bring you into this conversation. Let's start with you, David. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I just really wanted to reaffirm what the mayor said about the importance of creating that vision and that kind of more comprehensive and holistic planning process. Because I think something I noticed, and I served in my hometown in the mayor's office in Detroit, Michigan before Opportunity Insights, and a lot of what I saw working on housing projects individually and policy is that, right, there are so many obstacles and so many debates around every single project. Either it's not enough affordable housing or too much affordable housing, or it looks one way or it looks another way, that it's really important to have that broader framework and to really have community buy-in beforehand. And so we worked on a proposal called the Strategic Neighborhoods Fund, which basically was providing incentives for development along with other neighborhood amenities, but it was all couched and was all determined by a community engaged planning process. And what that allowed us to do was really set that vision to say, hey, we have these principles of affordability, but also really creating new housing because we know that's important for the growth of our city and our economic growth. And so having that framework in place, we then said, we're not then going to debate every single project, but as long as that project fits within this greater framework, it makes it much easier to pass through all the approvals needed to actually build it. And so I think thinking of how do you create those carrots, to create those resources necessary for communities who may not have the capacity to do that planning, I think could be a really great incentive to, one, build more housing, but really build in a way that really does follow these principles and values that can be built up through a community engaged process.
Right, having that vision, then that holistic vision, like you mentioned. Mike, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have a lot of experience working with local jurisdictions and state agencies and government, across the country. And I think one of the challenges is, figuring out that appropriate balance of what should fall within the local jurisdictions versus what the state can do, particularly as Mayor mentioned, on the carrot side of the equation. And I think, exclusionary zoning is one thing now where the states can provide a sort of kind of like political cover, make decisions that are difficult for local leaders to make because of known opposition. And so that can be, a role where, although it's in a sense usurping local control, it can be helpful in that sense. I think another one that is not as often talked about, but is becoming increasingly more important, is this notion of an understanding that housing markets are regional. And so if left to their own devices, individual jurisdictions can really lean into housing or include barriers. And I think particularly as it relates to providing housing units at a range of incomes, things like regional housing needs. So for example, in California, a RHNA process is now, a requirement. It's in its 5th cycle. certainly there are kind of areas for improvement and known challenges with what that process entails. But I think that the idea is a strong one, and Oregon has recently started looking into this as well. It's to say, if there's a known regional problem in terms of housing under production, how do we address this in a collaborative way that leverages individual jurisdictions beyond just what they would do on their own and vacuum in a silo? And I think those types of coordinations can be very helpful for kind of moving the needle in ways that individual jurisdictions would struggle to do on their own.
Great, thank you for that. And let's follow up a little bit regarding, the state's role in some of this. When legislation is created impacting local jurisdictions. So in California, for example, a proposal SB 6, which would allow commercial land to be used for residential purposes. How do you all think about the trade-offs and their associated benefits in terms of housing and economic development? And Mayor, let me go back to you and start with you on a question like that.
Well, I think flexible zoning is probably the way to go, and that's certainly the strategy we've employed here. As I said earlier, a form-based code that allows the market to drive use, but also establishes overall limits on different use categories. So I can't speak to California's experience specifically, but as a matter of principle, I think if we lock ourselves into one form of use or another, regardless of whether it's market responsive, then we will probably get no investment and no growth, and certainly not the optimum form of investment and growth.
Great. David, I see you nodding your head. Would love to get your thoughts.
I just agree with the mayor, but I'd love to hear Mike's perspective on it.
Okay, sounds good. Mike?
And I can speak a little bit to SB 6, but I think the idea here is to how to make it relatable to a wider audience than just California. But I think the idea here is what the mayor is getting at, which is to say exclusionary zoning, the policy discussion has focused mostly on detached neighborhoods, single family neighborhoods, et cetera, and allowing, a mix of uses in there. But at the same time, there are opportunities in lands that are zoned exclusively for commercial lands. And these are typically, areas that are adjacent to transit, that are jobs rich, et cetera. And if they're not permissive of housing as well, that is also a lost opportunity. And I think SB 6 is a state-level initiative that's really looking at allowing a mix of uses, including housing on commercial lands. And I think the challenge is, when you look at individual local jurisdictions, they're very protective of, and rightly so, industrial lands and employment opportunities because of the local fiscal constraints that are imposed in various states. So in California, for example, sales tax is a large contributor to the general fund. So when a local jurisdiction is faced with the choice of a perception around housing being a drain on resources, I think, as the mayor mentioned, versus something that is a net positive, it's really about educating that what are these trade-offs, and can you introduce a mix of uses that takes, let's say, an underutilized commercial asset. So you have a lot of strip malls that are vacant, underutilized, surface parking. How could you go in and revitalize and redevelop that into where you maybe are net adding retail, but also revitalizing it through a mix of uses that's allowing for access to opportunity, transit, et cetera. And so I think this is a growing area of a policy discussion at the state level that's really looking to enable kind of by right permissive uses on commercial zones in a similar way that the vein is around exclusionary detached single family neighborhoods.
Wonderful, thank you. Appreciate all your comments on that. I'm going to switch a little bit in terms of, political opposition, to housing production. That's obviously another known, and navigating that, managing that, how do you see that as something that we can overcome at the local level? And let me start with Mayor Bramson on that one.
Sure, and obviously that's important. We live in a democracy. It's hard to have a durable policy which doesn't enjoy sustained majority support. So look, the kinds of folks who participate in conferences like this one tend to regard growth as self-evidently beneficial. That is not true for many people who associate density with construction and noise and overburdened services and a diminished quality of life. And so there needs to be engagement with folks who have that perception in order to understand how they will benefit from a potentially changed environment. In part, that's a substantive challenge because some of those concerns can be well-founded. And if growth is not planned carefully, if the impacts are not considered in advance, if you are not assuring yourself that resources will be generated to cover whatever burdens are associated with development, then you can have problems. So to use just one example, we looked very carefully at student generation that would be associated with downtown growth. We looked at the spatial constraints of specific school buildings. We tried to determine when there would be tipping points that might necessitate school expansion or construction. And then we made sure that there was a revenue stream flowing to our school district that could absorb those costs. And that was a great source of reassurance to people who may have had legitimate concerns about whether we would have overcrowded classrooms or rising tax bills. In part, this is a communications issue and an engagement issue. As David spoke about in Detroit, having an upfront conversation with your community about what it is we're trying to accomplish and really providing robust opportunities, multi-platform opportunities for people to register their opinions, to offer feedback, genuine two-way conversation, so that when the vision is set and hardwired into your zoning code, you can be confident that the individual projects are consistent with what the community itself was expressed in terms of its desires for where we're going. So that's vital as well. And I think if you do those things successfully, then you put yourself in a much better position to execute. But then remember, if you're chasing unanimity, that's paralytic. And at a certain point, people in leadership positions simply need to demonstrate the political will to move forward and feel confident that the benefits that manifest on the ground will ultimately persuade skeptics that a growth strategy is one that is beneficial to everyone.
And I guess, I mean, that engagement, if you've done that process to engage communities, the political will hopefully be there, right, to act on that. Obviously you're not going to get 100% in any manner, but really appreciate those words. David, Mike, anything you would like to add to this conversation about handling or overcoming opposition?
Yeah, no, I think I would just add, well, one, I think housing is such a interesting political category where you get kind of different types of opposition from different areas of the political spectrum that usually aren't coming together. So again, I mentioned my work in Detroit, and oftentimes, right, disinvested communities, folks who had seen, decades of disinvestment in their neighborhoods, and when you talked about new investment and new possibilities, there was lots of skepticism, right? And I think it was well founded. They've been promised things for a very long time, and when they hear about new developments and exciting things, I think there was a thought that, we understand why this could be good, but we don't really think this is for us. And so I think kind of overcoming that, building trust, I think oftentimes through those visioning processes, but also through that deep engagement to really build trust in communities. And then on the other hand, right, you often have neighborhoods that have been invested in for a very long time, but oftentimes, as I think Mike really spoke to, we're not creating the type of access to more diverse types of housing and development. And so in some ways, you can sometimes create interesting political bedfellows who aren't for increased housing production. But I do think that having a data-informed approach, doing the work to understand well-founded concerns about development is helpful. But I again do think that it's helpful to frame those in a larger vision. So if you say we need to create affordable housing for X, Y, and Z reason, we need new development for these purposes, and we're going to take into account these concerns and agree on that to start, and then do the work to say, okay, here are the concerns. We've really mapped out what that'll look like. Here's how we'll mitigate it. Here's what we perceive as the benefits, as we've already talked about and agreed to. I think that can, persuade those folks who are thoughtful and who are coming to the conversation, willing to be persuaded if the data is there. I think to the mayor's point, there will also be folks who will just use whatever data they have, whatever perceptions they have, to just rail against development in general. And so I think, doing the work to create consensus where possible, but then, not just, debating over and over again, thinking that you're going to get everybody on the same page, I think is an important piece to keep in mind. And then just one quick point, I do think that, again, that equity lens can be an added data point that I think people oftentimes overlook. So kind of saying, again, it's not just about production, it's not just about creating a new tower, but again, in many ways, housing can change lives in ways that we see the kind of fruits of 10, 15, 20 years down the road. I think that's a helpful point to include and embed in these conversations as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's an added benefit to start, like you said earlier, leading with that equity lens. Mike, anything you would like to add to this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think economists are notorious for living in data echo chambers. And so I think, what the mayor and David were saying is right. I mean, I think you can't just say, growth is self-evidently good, because that may actually not be true for everyone. And I think building a consensus of views is crucial. And so organizations like Up for Growth that I think really leverage evidence basis and data to help describe what those trade-offs are. So you can have an honest conversation with somebody that, yes, there is a trade-off, and in some instances there may be a benefit here and a cost here, but in aggregate, this is the path forward. I think is really a big added value of an organization like Up for Growth, where these conversations were really much more siloed, let's say 10 years ago, than they are today. And I think that's credit to certainly Up for Growth, but now that you're seeing at all levels of government, federally, state level, and locally, some advances that are being made.
Great. Thank you very much. Rich conversation, all of you. Thank you very much for your contributions there. And as we round out the last few minutes of this panel, I have a question for all of you, and it's really around the best practices that can be utilized to ensure that there's better alignment between economic development and housing production. Your thoughts on what those best practices are. And then before we jump into that question, if anyone in the audience has questions, I believe there's a Q&A button here that will flag it for me, and happy to take any audience questions if we have any few minutes left. But why don't we start with you, Mayor, and get your thoughts on that alignment?
Well, let me try to emphasize and build upon some of the things we've already said. I do think that making sure that ESG principles are firmly embedded in our development frameworks is enormously important. And ideally, you can even create areas which are sort of pre-qualified for lending institutions, developers, sources of capital who are interested in ESG but concerned about how you assure accountability, how you audit things. If you have a sufficiently robust framework that's backstopped with government policy, then you can really create a climate in which ESG investments are facilitated, and that's something that we're trying to pursue in New Rochelle, because we think we have the building blocks for it. I also think we have to get out of the habit of thinking, as some people do, of the real estate community as the enemy. If we want sustainable growth is half of that equation, and real estate interests have to be fully engaged. And so finding that balance point, and this is something that Mike mentioned earlier, that enables investment to occur successfully, and yet also delivers public benefits. I think that's vital. If we're only concerned about profit for builders, then we're missing the boat in terms of environmental and social justice. If we're completely unconcerned about profit for developers, then all we have is dreams without any production of housing or any other form of growth. So finding that balance is critical.
Thank you for that. David?
Yeah, no, I think kind of stole the words out of my mouth, Mr. Mayor. I would make 2 points. I think one, and I think to a point that Mike made earlier actually, is about breaking down some of these silos, right? Because housing relates to parks, relates to businesses, relates to all these different functions. So if you just have a planning department, housing department working in different lanes, I think you're really missing out. And so kind of understanding how you create these more comprehensive visions through thoughtful planning processes, I think can really frame this work and kind of make sure it's all coming together. And I think the other piece was, we talked about engaging the community. Again, our real estate professionals are part of our community. And I think understanding as we're developing these different models, incentive structures, zoning codes, really talking to the folks who have to do the work to understand if this works from their perspective. Now, obviously, right, they shouldn't be driving these processes, but their perspective, and if what we hope will incentivize growth and development, we should be talking to the folks who will be, at the end of the day, responsible for executing on that. So I think thinking through how to both engage the community and the professional sectors who will have to execute on these visions, is very important. I think we should be, kind of elevating, successful models like New Rochelle who've been able to find that balance.
Wonderful, thank you. And Mike, let me go to you on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I tend to reject the notion that there is a best practice or a one-size-fits-all policy. And I think as we work with communities across the country, both urban and rural, ones that are growing, ones that are stagnating, I think that's the key, is understanding what the state of affairs is today, in the sense that you have communities that are, say, legacy communities that maybe aren't growing, are looking to focus much more on revitalization and catalytic projects. You have policy, communities that are growing rapidly, both in terms of the land scale, but maybe not delivering opportunity in other neighborhoods. And then you have kind of where everyone tends to focus, which are these really expensive communities where housing affordability is a challenge, and overcoming those obstacles. I think, to me, one of the things that you can start from is, if there is such a thing as a best practice, is understanding what your existing infrastructure is. Everyone always wants to start from pie in the sky. What should we do? I think understanding, you have to ground that in existing, leveraging the assets that you have, and whether that be transit or walkability or open space or underutilized assets, and how you can think about redeveloping those versus building everything from scratch, I think is a key thing. And then again, calibrating that mix between public and private partnership has got to be key, because the market's not going to do everything that the public sector wants, and certainly vilifying the public sector as the problem, when in fact they're oftentimes a large part of the solution, is going to be key. So I think kind of just approaching it with that mindset is a good place to start.
All of you, great points, but all of you have just provided great information to this conversation. I know great examples for Up for Growth to run with. So I want to thank all of you for that. There is a question in the meeting chat, and it's for you, Mayor. So let me just read it here. It's what data or analysis did you use to determine which approaches to use to turn around their stagnant market? What led them to form based code and upfront environmental review, for instance? And this is from Carl Schroeder. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Carl. Well, look, we had a lived experience for 30 years of trying to chase development, which, as I said earlier, yielded some successes, but a lot of failures. Some folks who simply did not want to come to the table, other projects that had been proposed and had fallen by the wayside because of either economic or political obstacles. And so even though we had intrinsic assets that should be favorable to growth, excellent location, good mass transit, talented, diverse population, we clearly were falling short of our potential, and we knew that we had to do something different. We also knew, as I said earlier, that whatever vision we articulated had to align with the realities of the marketplace. And so designating a master developer to work with us as a partner helped bring a sort of a real world perspective to the table, and enabled us to test certain propositions against fiscal and economic fact. So that was sort of the initial genesis of the development of our zoning code. And then the environmental review went through the full rigorous process that New York State requires, which is comprehensive in terms of traffic, infrastructure, socioeconomic benefits and costs, impacts associated with construction, demands on resources and public utilities. So all of the things that we would associate with an examination of a particular high density, high intensity project were applied to the overall build-out scheme. That, again, was an expensive, time-consuming process, and one that featured extensive and necessary public input. But it's all paid off because those obstacles and burdens are now not attached to any particular project that meets our vision.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor, for that. I don't see any other questions. And as we wrap up and bring this session to a close, maybe each of you could take a minute to do a closing statement, and I think our audience would enjoy that. I'm just going to go in the way I see you here. Let's go David, Mike, and we'll finish off with the mayor.
Yep. So one, just really enjoyed this conversation today. And I think my biggest takeaway is that an organization like Up for Growth is so uniquely positioned to bring together these various stakeholders who I think can all really contribute to these important conversations to actually moving towards impact and greater housing production. And I would just, suggest and reaffirm that, don't just include equity in the conversation, but lead with equity as a way to really galvanize communities and other folks who are part of this conversation can use that to help invigorate this conversation on housing production.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've enjoyed the conversation as well. And I think to reiterate kind of this, the benefit, as David said, of having the organizations like this are the breaking down of silos. But I think, some of the challenges with that are, how do you overcome these known obstacles that each of those, constituencies would bring to the table? And I think having a basis of trust and communication first that is around quantifying trade-offs so that you can build consensus in an informed way, is a challenging process. It takes time, but in the end leads to actionable outcomes that when are implemented, right, actually, as the example in New Rochelle, change the status quo. I think, a lot of times the focus is all on the process and then it just gets put on the shelf and nothing happens. So I think, starting with the end in mind first and working your way backwards is key. And Up for Growth, I think, has really been successful in kind of leading the path on how to successfully do that.
Great, thank you. Mayor?
Yeah, I just want to say I feel really privileged to be part of this conversation and to learn from great minds like Dave and Mike and you, Maria, and to be associated with Up for Growth. And I think this kind of marriage of a macro perspective, global and national, with local execution makes all of us wiser and more effective. So thank you for including me.
Great. Well, that brings us to a close of this session. I'd like to thank our incredible panelists, David, Mike, Mayor Bramson. Your contributions to this conversation about how to address this housing underproduction that we have has truly been very rich, but with real specific examples that you have all cited. So I want to give you just my appreciation, and on behalf of Up for Growth, I know we will all give you a virtual applause, everyone in this audience here, if we were in person. So for all of you that are listening to this presentation, hopefully there have been some nuggets, some great takeaways. I want to thank Up for Growth for their convening power and bringing together leaders in this space that can really provide the insight and the guidance that we need to make sure we're addressing this underproduction that we're facing in housing. The views expressed here were just incredible to hear it from all different perspectives. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Up for Growth.